Hey folks, welcome to week 2 of US Society. I'm just here to give you a couple of highlights in a quick lecture overview. Just some reminders that you should be doing your quiz by Wednesday and your second quiz by Sunday night. I'm just doing your best to keep up with the readings in both of the books, both Wright and Rogers and Righteous Dopamine. So I wanted to just jump in and give you a couple of things that I think are highlights from this week's readings. The first would be related to healthcare, and I gave you that Michael Moore documentary to take a look at. It's a little bit outdated, but I think it helps to reveal some interesting things about what happens even when people have health insurance or healthcare coverage, and some of the people that kind of fall in the gaps. The entire documentary is really interesting, but you only have to watch those first 30 minutes or so. And for the most part, the book is trying to remind us that the healthcare system in the United States doesn't necessarily serve people very well because of the fact that it's market-based. That market-based notion really means that it's part of a system in which profits are an ultimate goal. And so when that happens, it's not necessarily that keeping people healthy and keeping people well is the focus. It's really that there are a kind of convoluted series of purposes to the healthcare system in the United States. And so that's kind of trying to balance this issue of corporations and healthcare systems and health insurance companies needing to make a profit because of shareholders, and then the actual people who need healthcare on the other side. So despite the fact that in the United States we might have some really high-tech, fancy, innovative aspects to our healthcare system, it doesn't mean that on average people in the United States are equally able to access that. And what you see in the chapter on healthcare is that really our healthcare outcomes in the United States are pretty far behind some of the other industrialized nations we would compare ourselves to. So we don't do very well when we think about life expectancy or infant mortality, things like that. So these kind of basic level healthcare outcomes, we're not necessarily ahead of the pack when it comes to that. So just keep that in mind, that the market-based nature of our healthcare system really does have some outcomes that maybe aren't as ideal as we would want them to be. I also included a couple of slides to try and give you some more information about the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act is what we sometimes hear called Obamacare, and so that was passed in 2010 under Obama. And with that healthcare bill, what we essentially see is a range of different restrictions and requirements that health insurance entities must abide by. So it has to do with, for people who are, I think, under the age of 26, it allows you to stay on your parents' health insurance if they have health insurance. It also makes it illegal for health insurance companies to be prejudiced against people with pre-existing conditions. So before the Affordable Care Act, if you had something like diabetes, an insurance company could say, we don't want to insure you because you're too expensive. So with the Affordable Care Act, it basically made that practice illegal. And then it also established these kind of healthcare markets that we see at the state level. I gave you some slides on that Medicaid gap. So essentially when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, states could choose to expand their Medicaid system. So that's the insurance at that state level. And so what's interesting about that is that because of political values, because of political differences across regions and in different states, some states opted to really go all in and expand Medicaid and provide more health insurance coverage to lower income people. And then some states, because of political reasons, decided, we don't want to do that. So what's interesting is just looking at the different rates of insured and uninsured folks by region. So I tried to give you some ideas about what that looks like. The reasons why we might be concerned about this is just that some folks are not necessarily as able to access health care or health insurance as we might like, and that means that when people aren't accessing health care in a routine and regular way, they're oftentimes using emergency rooms for primary care treatment. They're not necessarily going to use preventative measures. So there's lots of different reasons why a lack of access to health care might be a problem from a just health outcome perspective. And so we have some concerns potentially here when we think about, okay, well, what happens if people in Texas aren't insured and then maybe aren't actually accessing the healthcare system? What are the health outcomes there? So some of those things are really great questions. We have a number of classes on healthcare, and medical sociology is a subfield. So these are all things you could answer in other classes, but I just want to give you a sense of what that looks like here. I do encourage you to read more. I tried to give you a quick little, here's a news article with all the things that are happening with the Affordable Care Act. It is certainly something the Trump administration has talked at length about repealing or replacing or changing, but at the moment, it's not really clear exactly where that's at. So I just gave you a timeline as to where things had started in 2017 and kind of where we are now. Not too many significant things have happened, but then there's a lot of little kind of wiggling in terms of trying to reduce some of the impacts of the Affordable Care Act. So I encourage you to read that timeline if you get a chance. Okay, shifting gears. Poverty and class and economics are kind of all these other questions of the chapters this week. I do think poverty and healthcare are intimately connected to each other. You can imagine that people who are living in poverty, people who are barely making ends meet, that those folks are having a particularly hard time accessing the healthcare system or paying for healthcare costs. So we have to see these things as interrelated to some degree. But with the chapters on poverty, I wanted to just call your attention to the fact that we do have a relatively high rate of income inequality. Actually, if you compare the United States to other countries around the world, we actually have one of the higher rates of income inequality. So that means the kind of gap between the people who are the richest and the people who are the poorest. And here you also see that we have a relatively high poverty rate as compared to other countries. So page 268 says we've got a 17.3% poverty rate, which is the highest when we compare ourselves to other countries who are kind of similar to our own. Some of the sources of poverty here, this is a complicated question, but I think at a minimum we can think about the fact that we are kind of in an era in which globalization has meant that many of our manufacturing jobs, many of the lower skilled, lower wage jobs that people previously had access to have gone to other parts of the world. In addition to that, I think that we are seeing people in the United States spending more and more on housing and on food and on healthcare and on childcare. And so all of those things combine to make it so that people's life chances or life outcomes are complex and complicated. I wanted to also point out to you, of course, and we're going to be talking about race and ethnicity and gender next week, but that these questions of poverty are not sort of uniform, that different groups are stratified in different ways. So people of color in the United States, women with small children in particular, they're going to be, more or less likely to be living in poverty as compared to other groups. So just think about this as something that certainly is stratified. People of color are much more likely to live in poverty than white Americans are, and the same thing is true for kind of women. Single-headed households are also much more likely to be represented in some of those poverty demographics. And it's also really, really important, I think, always to remind ourselves that children are one of the largest groups living in poverty in the United States. Children are significantly impacted by some of the economic policies that we have and some of the practices that create inequality in the U.S. I think that the other things that are really useful here are just the kind of sociological perspective on how do we make sense of poverty, why do we have this inequality that we have, and they talk about the fact that there are many different ways that we could think about it, but that we, in the U.S., I think, want to consistently move away from that cycle of poverty notion, that sociologists are not really interested in sort of saying, we have poor people because they're poor. It's this complicated argument where if you use that cycle of poverty notion, like if you were in a poor family, then you're destined to grow up poor. It's not necessarily that simple. The issue is that there are kind of limited life chances, limited ways in which people lack access to opportunities or lack access to resources, and that is potentially going to connect to a person's life chances or potential for upward mobility. But we want to not say like it's like a hereditary thing, or that if you grow up in a family that's poor, you're destined to be poor yourself because of the kind of cultural context. It's more that there's a structural condition there, that you are limited from, moving ahead and, advancing in a career or acquiring the skills and education that you need, not that your family has taught you that you are poor and therefore you will always be poor. So I think that that's a nuanced argument there, but think about it as it's not a cultural explanation that sociologists embrace, it's a structural explanation. We want to understand why certain families or certain groups are lacking access to the skills and opportunities, not necessarily saying this group is destined to be poor because they've always been poor. That is not at all what we want to do. Pages 286 and 287 have some really good explanations for these social structural causes, and those are the ones I really want you to be thinking about. They talk about inequalities generated through exclusion from labor markets, inequalities within labor markets themselves, and inequalities generated through non-labor market income. So these are all different forms that inequality can take. And so I want you to pay attention to those because I think those are really important. And as sociologists, those are the things that we're tending to do research on and that we're really interested in, the structural causes, not the social causes of inequality, which we tend to be very skeptical of. Okay, briefly, I know that this video is starting to get long. I wanted to also, I have included some John Oliver link. I know he swears a lot and he includes Cardi B swearing a lot, so I'm sorry. But I think that his analysis of corporate taxes and the kind of corporate welfare system is really interesting. It shows us the fact that in the United States, corporations are able to and do go to great lengths to avoid participating in the tax system and the tax structure in the United States. What that means is that when we don't require corporations who are based here or who are from the United States to contribute to our tax base, it means that we just have less money overall to go to things like education or healthcare or military. And so thinking about how we set certain priorities, military becomes this huge priority in the United States. And then when we don't have that corporate tax base, the kind of social stuff tends to fall by the wayside. So thinking about how potentially, if we're not holding corporations as responsible as we are, individual citizens, what is the outcome there? What happens when we have less revenue or less resources overall to support the priorities that we set? So I want you to watch that video. I think it's really interesting. And also, I include it because it reminds us that when we think about welfare, we tend to have this stigmatized, it's something that people access and it's only for very low income people. What we actually find is that there are many, many different people who benefit from different kinds of welfare, different kinds of subsidies or tax breaks in the United States. And so this component of the actual income transfer that we typically think of as welfare is actually a very small percentage of the amount of subsidies or the amount of tax breaks we're giving to corporations, to homeowners, to college students, right? The book is really good at reminding us that it's a much larger umbrella that we're talking about. Okay, the last thing I'll say before I set you loose is that Righteous Dope Fiend, you are reading some significant chunks of that this week, and I just want you to be paying attention to these same kinds of questions about poverty. What are some of those structural causes that the Edgewater homeless encountered that kind of limited their life chances or that led to the fact that they are homeless at this point. So thinking about those dynamics in the context of San Francisco, in the context of globalization, I think that there's some really good discussions in the book about how the transformation of the city of San Francisco from being this place where people could access lower wage, lower skilled jobs in the shipping and the kind of manufacturing industries, as those went away, there wasn't much that took its place. And so because of that, there's some really constrained economic capabilities of folks in the San Francisco region, and that tells part of the story of why the Edgewater folks end up unhoused, and in part why we see them ending or falling into the drug use and drug addiction. I think this also has some parallels. The book that we're reading is specifically this ethnography of this one encampment, but I think it's really fascinating to think about how those economic drivers are related to the current opioid epidemic that we're seeing in kind of the Midwest and the kind of West Virginia region of the United States, where we're seeing huge amounts of people experiencing opioid addiction and overdose. And so we have to kind of look at, those are some of the same places where we're seeing economic constraints and a lack of job opportunities. And so it's not crazy to start to tie together poverty and healthcare and our larger economic system into this one cohesive analysis of what are some of these constraints and pressures on people in the United States. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. I hope that you will keep up with all of the readings and follow as many of those links in my PowerPoint lecture as you are able to. But please do watch that John Oliver clip. I think there's a quick quiz question, so it's one that's really worth your time. Okay, I will talk to you soon. Bye.